for 8, 16, 32, and so on. Eventually one discovers that it's not boring at all, but very interesting. An Indian lady invited me to dinner, and Dr. Suzuki would be there. He was. Before dinner I mentioned Gertrude Stein. Dr. Suzuki had never heard of her. I described aspects of her work, which he said sounded very interesting. Stimulated, I mentioned James Joyce. His name was also new to him. At dinner he was unable to eat the curries that were offered, so a few uncooked vegetables and fruits were brought, which he enjoyed. After dinner the talk turned to metaphysical problems, and there were many questions, for the hostess was a follower of a certain Indian yogi, and her guests were more or less equally divided between allegiance to Indian thought and to Japanese thought. At about 11 o'clock we were out on the street walking along, and an American lady said to Dr. Suzuki, "How is it, Dr. Suzuki? We spend the evening asking you questions and nothing is decided." Dr. Suzuki smiled and said, "That's why I love philosophy. No one wins." Before studying Zen, men are men and mountains are mountains. While studying Zen, things become confused. After studying Zen, men are men and mountains are mountains. After telling this, Dr. Suzuki was asked, "What is the difference between before and after?" He said, "No difference. Only the feet are a little bit off the ground." M.C. Richards went to see the Bolshoi. She was delighted with the dancing. She said, "It's not what they do, it's the ardour with which they do it." I said, "Yes, composition, performance, and audition or observation are really different things. They have next to nothing to do with one another." Once I told her I was at a house on Riverside Drive where people were invited to present a Zen service conducted by a Japanese Roshi. He did the ritual, rose petals and all. Afterwards, tea was served with rice cookies, and then the hostess and her husband, employing an out-of-tune piano and a cracked voice, gave a wretched performance of an excerpt from a third-rate Italian opera. I was embarrassed and glanced towards the Roshi to see how he was taking it. The expression on his face was absolutely beatific. 2 wooden boxes containing Indian spices and foodstuffs arrived from India. One was for David Tudor, the other for me. Each of us found, on opening his box, that the contents were all mixed up. The lids of plastic containers of spices had somehow come off. Plastic bags for dried beans and palm sugar had ripped open. The tin lid cans of chili powder had come off. All of these things were mixed together, and I, with the excelsior which had been put in the box to keep the containers in position, I put my box in a corner and simply tried to forget about it. David Tudor, on the other hand, set to work assembling bowls of various sizes, sieves of about 11 various sized screens, a pair of tweezers and a small knife. He began a process which lasted 3 days, at the end of which time each spice was separated from one another, each kind of bean from each other, and the palm sugar lumps had been scraped free of spice, and excavations in them had to be removed in bedded beans. He called me up to say, "Whatever you want to get at that box of spices you have, let me know. I'll help you." When the Depression began, I was in Europe. After a while, I came back and lived with a family in the Pacific Palisades. I'd read somewhere that Richard Bullig, the pianist, had lived years before in Berlin and given the first performance of Schoenberg's Opus 2. I thought to myself, he probably lives right here in Los Angeles, so I looked in the phone book and sure enough there was his name. I called him up and said, I'd like to hear you play the Schoenberg pieces. He said he wasn't contemplating giving a recital. I said, well, surely you can play at home. Couldn't I come over one day and hear Opus? He said, certainly not. He hung up. Then about a year later, the family had to give up the house in the Palisades. Mother and Dad went to an apartment in Los Angeles. I found an auto court in Santa Monica, where in exchange for doing the gardening, I got an apartment to live in and a large room back at the court over the garages, which I used at a lecture hall. I was 19 years old and enthusiastic about modern music and painting. I went from house to house in Santa Monica explaining this to the housewives. I offered 10 lectures for $2.50. I said I will learn each week something about the subject I will lecture them on. Well, the week came for my lecture on Schoenberg, except for a minuet, Opus 25. His music was too difficult for me to play. No recordings were then available. I thought of Richard Bulig. I decided not to telephone him, but to go direct to his house and visit him. I hitchhiked into LA. Arriving at his house at noon, he wasn't home. I took a pepper bough off a tree and pulling the leaves off one by one, recited, he'll come home, he won't, he'll come home, etc. Well, it always turned out he'll come home. He did. At midnight, I explained I've been waiting to see him for 12 hours. He invited me into the house. When I asked him to illustrate my lecture on Schoenberg, he said, certainly not. However, he said he'd like to see some of my compositions, and we made an appointment for the following week. One of Suzuki's books ends with the poetic text of a Japanese monk describing his attainment of enlightenment. The final poem says, now that I'm enlightened, I'm just as miserable as ever.